In Edinburgh's Old Town, there are full-size windows looking into solid earth. Windows built to face a street that no longer exists at that level. The street came up around them and kept going, and now they're basement windows pointing at nothing. This is not unique to Edinburgh. It is documented in city after city, continent after continent, in a specific historical window. And the sediment that buried those windows doesn't look like gradual accumulation. It looks like an event. I want to begin with a basement in Edinburgh. Not a famous basement, not a tourist attraction. A working basement in the Old Town. One of thousands of below street level spaces in that city, where the medieval and early modern street level was raised, officially for sanitation reasons, in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in this basement, which I am describing from documented surveys rather than personal visit, there is a window. A full-size window. Not a vent, not an air gap, but a window with a proper surround, proportioned for human habitation, positioned at what is now approximately 2 meters below street level. The window looks into solid earth. It has been there since the building was constructed, whenever that was, at whatever level the ground was at when the builders positioned it to look out onto a street or a courtyard that was then at that height. Now someone raised the street. 2 meters, in this location, 2 meters of fill, of accumulated material, of what the official accounts describe as gradual urban accumulation over centuries of habitation, brought the external ground level up past the bottom of the window, past the sill, past the top of the window, until the window that looked out onto a street now looks into earth. The window was not bricked up, not demolished, not modified, just buried. The building was not demolished and rebuilt at the new grade. Just a street came up around it, and the lower level became, quietly and without apparent drama, a basement with windows that no longer have anything to see. I became interested in this phenomenon, not because of Edinburgh specifically, but because Edinburgh is one of dozens of cities where it is documented and measurable and impossible to deny. The physical evidence of a raised street level is not controversial. Cities do raise their streets. Edinburgh raised its streets. Chicago raised its streets dramatically and officially in the 1850s and 1860s, by up to 3 meters in some areas. St. Petersburg was built in a period of massive landfill operations. Boston filled in its back bay in the second half of the 19th century. The raising of city street levels is a documented historical phenomenon, with documented causes, usually drainage sanitation, the management of flood risk in low-lying areas. What is less discussed is the specific character of the sediment in these raised zones, and what that character tells you about how it arrived. Because the material that raised the street level in many cities of the 19th century was not the gradual accumulation of human occupation that archaeologists typically find in sites of continuous habitation. It was not the layered stratigraphy of sequential use, with identifiable periods of habitation separated by thin transition zones. It was, in many documented cases, a layer of relatively uniform material, deposited in what the stratigraphy suggests was a relatively short time period, on top of an existing surface that showed signs of abrupt abandonment or disruption. This is the geological and stratigraphic form of the mudflood hypothesis, not the dramatic flood of Noah version, where walls of water rolled across continents. Something more targeted, more specific. A deposition event, or series of events, that deposited significant quantities of material across urban areas in the mid to late 18th or early 19th century. burying existing ground floors, existing street-level infrastructure, existing windows and doorways, and providing a new, higher grade from which subsequent construction proceeded. The subsequent builders, finding this new grade, building their new structures on the new surface, creating the appearance from the outside of a seamless building whose lower levels are simply the basement of what stands above. The seam, the transition from one civilization's work to another's, is below the current street level, out of sight, filed under basement. The Seattle Underground Tour makes this visible, and this is why I find Seattle so useful as an analytical case. Seattle's Underground Tour, officially described as a consequence of the 1889 Great Seattle Fire and the subsequent decision to raise the streets by 1 to 2 stories for drainage reasons, takes visitors through the original street-level spaces of the pre-1889 city. And what those spaces reveal is not the charred remnants of a fire-damaged town quickly rebuilt. They reveal a construction quality, a spatial organization, a materiality that is inconsistent with the official history of Seattle as a frontier settlement founded in the 1850s. The underground spaces show brick and masonry work, proportions and spatial relationships, ceiling heights and structural details that suggest not a frontier town 30 years old, but an urban tradition considerably more mature and more sophisticated than the official timeline provides for. The official explanation is that Seattle was a thriving city by 1889, and its commercial district reflects that prosperity. And that explanation is not wrong exactly. But thriving frontier cities 30 years old do not typically develop the architectural vocabulary on display in those underground spaces. Architectural vocabulary takes time. It requires a tradition of craft, of accumulated technical knowledge, of design conventions that develop over generations. The underground spaces of Seattle reflect an architectural maturity that the official timeline simply doesn't account for. This pattern repeats, with unsettling precision, as I always end up saying, because the precision is what makes it alarming. It repeats in the underground spaces exposed by various construction and excavation projects across North American and European cities in the 19th and 20th centuries. Consistently, the below-grade spaces, the spaces beneath the raised street level, beneath the deposition layer, reflect an architectural quality that exceeds what the official history of those locations assigns to the period before the raising. Consistently, the transition zone, the layer between the old surface and the new fill, is sharper than gradual accumulation would produce. Consistently, the material in the deposition layer lacks the stratigraphic complexity of long-term human occupation and resembles instead what geologists call an event deposit. Material laid down in a relatively brief and relatively energetic period. Let me be specific about what event deposits look like in the stratigraphy. When material is deposited gradually, over centuries of human occupation, you find layers. Thin bands of organic material, charcoal, food waste, broken ceramics, the accumulated detritus of daily life, each layer distinct from the layers above and below. Recording the passage of time in identifiable increments. When material is deposited rapidly, as flood events, volcanic deposits, or large-scale sediment transport events produce, you find instead a relatively homogeneous layer, sometimes with graded bedding showing the largest particles at the bottom and finer material toward the top. But without the thin stratigraphic complexity of gradual accumulation, below the rapid deposit you find the previous surface. Above it, whatever was built or deposited subsequently. The subsurface stratigraphy of several 19th-century urban sites
shows a profile that is more consistent with an event deposit than with gradual accumulation. A relatively homogeneous layer of material at depths corresponding to the buried street level, sitting atop a previous surface that shows evidence of existing construction, and overlaid by the new construction of the post-deposit period. The official explanation for this profile is gradual fill, the accumulated material of urban street maintenance, construction debris, and drainage improvement over decades. And gradual fill does produce these profiles under some conditions, but the scale and uniformity of the deposition in the most dramatic cases is difficult to explain purely through gradual accumulation. What mechanism would produce event deposits across multiple urban sites on multiple continents in approximately the same historical period? This is the question at the center of the mudflood hypothesis, and it is a question that no mainstream archaeological or geological program has seriously attempted to answer, because mainstream programs don't accept the premise that such a simultaneous event deposit occurred. The evidence is either explained site by site as local phenomena, or is not acknowledged as unusual in the first place. The pattern, the fact that the same stratigraphic profile appears across cities on multiple continents in the same approximate period, is not a subject of mainstream academic inquiry. This is not because the evidence doesn't exist. It's because the question that the evidence raises is one that the existing narrative structure cannot accommodate. Because if there was a large-scale deposition event in the early to mid-19th century that buried the ground floors of existing structures across multiple continents, then those structures predate the deposition event. And the structures that predate the deposition event are, in many cases, the structures that the official histories assign construction dates in the mid to late 19th century, the inheritance period dates. The period after the event, which would mean that the official construction dates are wrong, which would mean that these buildings were here before the civilization that claims to have built them, which would mean that there was a previous occupant, a previous civilization, a civilization that built to a standard and at a scale that required when it disappeared a narrative explaining where all these buildings came from, and the narrative that was constructed. The official history of 19th century civic architecture is that narrative. I want to close with a practical question that I think about often. If you wanted to erase a civilization from the physical record while leaving its buildings standing, what would you do? You couldn't destroy the buildings. They are too massive, too numerous, too useful. You couldn't remove the evidence of their construction technique, because the technique is in the stone, and the stone remains. What you could do is raise the floor level, bury the foundations, cover the lower courses of masonry where the evidence of the earlier grade is most visible, fill in the ground floor windows, or let them disappear below the new grade so that over time they become basement windows, then basement vents, then blocked-up holes in the wall of a space nobody visits. Put your new street above the old one. Build your new narrative from the new grade, and leave everything below to the darkness and the accumulated silt of subsequent decades. Leave it to become, in time, what Edinburgh's buried windows have become. Evidence that no one looks at long enough to ask why it's there. The sediment record doesn't lie, but you have to be willing to read it. And reading it means asking the question that the official account has always moved past very quickly. Not what the deposition was, but when it happened, how it happened, at the same time in so many places, and what was underneath it when it arrived. The buildings, remember, the stratigraphy records. The buried windows wait in the dark below the street level, looking into nothing, waiting for someone to ask what they used to see.
If the stratigraphy beneath our cities is consistent with a rapid deposition event, one that occurred at roughly the same time across multiple continents, what caused it and what was underneath when it arrived? Tell us what you think in the comments, and share this with someone who has walked past a buried window and never thought to ask why it's there.